Still Around is a short film compilation that is presented as a feature film. It's 15 shorts. It involves 16 directors. Jörg and I are two of the directors, but we were also the executive producers. And it was really our attempt to do something really lively and important around HIV/AIDS and independent filmmaking, when we started in 2009. We came together as filmmakers and friends who felt that there was what I would broadly refer to as AIDS fatigue in the independent film world, especially in the first decade of the 2000s.
There were films being made around HIV and AIDS, but they were all historical documentaries that were looking back at the 80s, at the 90s, when the epidemic was the worst, when people were dropping like flies, when there was no cure, when there was no medication, when there was nothing and no hope. And that was important. We have to look at our history, but we specifically went out to do something about right here, right now.
It was also clear that we were in the middle of this really difficult economic downturn, and that these nonprofits were needing our help. We were living through a moment where nonprofit agencies working on HIV and AIDS were cutting their budgets, and so media and media production and marketing and messaging and all those things that are so vitally important for a nonprofit to be able to be effective were the first things that went out the window. Suddenly, we had skills that actually could fulfill a need, a really urgent need at these nonprofits. I remember specifically a conversation around Jörg's kitchen table in his apartment here in San Francisco one night where we were talking about the 2011 30th anniversary of HIV and AIDS. And I said to Jörg, whenever there's an anniversary, there's an opportunity. Anniversaries drive awareness, they drive fundraising, they drive partnerships, they drive everything because people can latch onto them really easily. They can kind of understand an anniversary. And the 30th anniversary of HIV/AIDS I knew was going to be important. And I knew it was going to be in 2.5 years. And so at that moment, I think we had both sort of said, hey, let's make an important HIV/AIDS film. And that was the kind of kernel of the idea. And then together, we started to put shape around what this could look like as a short film compilation.
The parameters of the compilation were that we said we want a film that ends up being about 80 to 90 minutes long. In the beginning, we were not set on a certain number of films, but we said we wanted every film to be no shorter than 3 minutes and no longer than 5 minutes.
We matched films and filmmakers, or filmmakers with stories, and that was a very deliberate impulse to take filmmakers from all backgrounds who were both emerging and established and everything in between in terms of the level of their career and their experience, and match them with real people who were what I would call storytelling partners.
We had more filmmakers than were actually ended up in the compilation. We had way more potential protagonists that ended up in the compilation, but we try to pair people up with each other, let them work out who they wanted to collaborate with. And then we also try to, after we got more and more films, we try to kind of thread them together in a way that made sense. It's not completely random. So there's a certain order in the way we put the 15 short films together, and we actually did end up not putting 2 other films that were finished into it just because in test screenings and as we were looking at it together, we realized that it was just not meshing well. So we sacrificed 2 films that I actually personally really like, but we sacrificed them for the bigger picture, which was this has got to work as a compilation.
Yeah, and and Jörg was very hands-on with the directors in terms of setting kind of production parameters. So even though there were 15 filmmaking teams, the films kind of look and feel similar in terms of they all have the same technical considerations. And we sort of created a kind of a shooting Bible and created an environment of support whereby we as producers would help the filmmakers execute within a formula that would make all the films work in a final feature film collaboration and presentation.
The idea to make a compilation, I think, came when we realized that, first of all, there are so many stories, especially here where we live in the Bay Area, that are all part of that patchwork, that quilt of contemporary stories about HIV and AIDS. It is very hard to imagine one film that summarizes all these very diverse and different stories of people that we see here, and this is only in the Bay Area, of people from different communities that are affected by it. A compilation seemed like the perfect way to do it, A, because it could reflect on different experiences around living with HIV and AIDS in the 21st century in different communities, different economic backgrounds, different racial background, different sexual orientations, different gender expressions, etc. But at the same time, it also allowed for us to create something that was going to work both as a full compilation, as a feature-length thing that you can program at a festival or you can show in a school or whatever. And at the same time, you can take the little pieces and just use the ones that you like. You want to create an event around women and HIV. You have 4 or 5 films in the compilation that are specifically about women dealing with HIV/AIDS. You want to do something about the Black experience around HIV and AIDS. There's 4 or 5 films in the compilation that will reflect on that. So regardless of what you want to do, you will find something in the compilation that will give you a starting point for a conversation, for a discussion, to make people think. We contacted our nonprofit community partners that we'd been in touch with about other things, and we put the word out in general and said, we are making this compilation about different experiences around HIV and AIDS. We want to have as broad a variety of stories that we represent as possible. So send us your people. Send us people that are willing to share their story in public, which is a big step for a lot of people. Coming out in private around your friends and family is one thing, but putting your story out on the screen, on the internet, is a whole other story. And despite of that, we had way more stories than we could ever use. I think we had about 60 or 70 potential stories that we could have made, all worthy and interesting and amazing. But we wanted to make sure that from the beginning, from the get-go, that we paired these protagonists with filmmakers that would really click. The idea was always that it's not just a filmmaker taking on a subject and making their film. We always wanted to make sure we have pairings where the protagonist has a say on what kind of film was going to be made about them, and that these two people really connected. And that's why we had this kind of speed dating process where filmmakers met sometimes with various subjects and they didn't connect with anyone, and the other way around, subjects that met different directors, and while they may have liked each other, there was no creative spark, so they would move on. And we encouraged that because we wanted to really have the perfect combinations where people felt that, especially the protagonists that had no experience in filmmaking, where they felt that their ideas around their own representation were heard enough that they felt they could actually become part of the creative process.
The HIV/AIDS pandemic is not over. We're now in year 35 of this thing, and there is no end in sight. Even the continuing story of HIV and AIDS in 2015 is a controversial one. If we look at something like PrEP, for example, which is top of mind right now in HIV prevention, is causing a lot of divisiveness among key stakeholders in the community. So very reminiscent of how people talked and thought about safer sex practice in the early days of the epidemic. Okay, so it continues to be at the forefront of our concerns in so many communities around the world. This epidemic is still raging out of control by every definition. We talk a lot about HIV becoming more manageable, about the cost of medications coming down on different continents, and this is all very, very true. Things are getting better, but we cannot decrease our commitment, to making sure that this pandemic, stays on the forefront of the minds of the public, because if we're not vigilant, it is a health pandemic. It will creep back in, and it will take over again. And it's insidious. Diseases that are, that are sort of, operating the way that HIV/AIDS does, can come back, and we must be vigilant. And I think that there's still so much healing left to explore around HIV and AIDS, the aftermath of this epidemic and pandemic on our communities. Time and again, through the process of making these films, of running this nonprofit, we personally interact with people who have their daily lives impacted by this disease all the time. And that's just in our immediate world, our little immediate world that we operate in. And whenever we get to step out of it, you can see the ripple effect. You can see the net effect of how HIV and AIDS continues to be a challenge to people everywhere. And so for that reason, the work that we're doing, needs to continue. It needs to happen, and it's vitally important.
Because of the fact that the 80s and the early 90s were so traumatic in terms of the deaths that we saw, and the fact that at some point there were medications that helped people out and that helped people survive, made such a big difference that a lot of people at that point, and even now, I think, still don't want to hear it. And even people who are HIV positive or are long-term survivors, I've talked to them, they don't want to hear about it, they don't want to talk about it. They don't care about this anymore because they feel like they've moved on, and it was too hard for them that they constantly want to be reminded. But the truth is that it is not over. It has just shifted. And it's very easy for people like us here in San Francisco, in the US, on the West Coast, in a city that is very progressive and that has a lot of outspoken advocates. It's very easy to forget that it has shifted to different communities. It has shifted into countries where 10 years ago nobody would even talk about HIV and AIDS. And now they realize that they have this underground net of people infecting each other because it's kept so on the down low and so hush. That is still happening. That hasn't changed, or it has just shifted. But in order for us to not forget that, somebody needs to, put the word out. Somebody needs to remind us that it's still here. Somebody needs to remind us that there are no other communities that are affected. Somebody needs to remind us that even if everybody who's HIV positive now was on treatment, that will create a whole another net of complications. Somebody's got to pay for it. Medications are expensive. Medications are not available in many parts of the world. So it is not over, it's just shifted. So as filmmakers who are interested in the subject matter, we do not need to stop talking about the dying. We just need to shift the conversation to what are we faced with right now. And as long as there's no treatment, there is a need to continue talking about it because, yes, you can take medications right now, but A, you need to be able to afford them, B, you need to have access to them, and C, you may have to face severe side effects. It's not that simple. It's not like you're just taking an aspirin. And I think a lot of people, especially in the younger generation, tend to forget that.